So we've been looking at environmental art, and I'm now looking at installation art, which is all part of one story, the way I've been telling the story. Art that is not in the white cube, or if it is in the white cube, it's thinking about the white cube as a space, or making you aware of the white cube. Often it's installation art is interested in spaces that have some history to them, or the physical properties of that space. We've looked up till now, at the end last week, on Friday we looked at outdoor spaces, but mostly we'll look at indoor spaces, not exclusively, but mostly now. It's always a little bit complicated how to compartmentalize artists. So many artists come back under more than one heading. For example, the first artist we look at, Joseph Beuys, he'll come back again pretty soon as a performance artist. He's under one heading. But it to some extent helps breaking things down like that. So it's art about space, not just about the objects in the space. Art about time as well, because a lot of installations could be temporary installations. So you have a sense of transiency. Remember, I was talking on Friday about Christo and Jean-Claude, how they almost sort of fetishize transiency of their work. We are inside often the artwork rather than looking at it from outside. We're walking through it. It's almost like our experience of architecture. We're often more an embodied spectator. Remember, with minimalism, you already got that idea of the embodied spectator. Site specificity is often important. Sometimes you can see installation art, it's almost like a breakdown of the boundary between art making and curatorship. Curators put art in a space. Installation artists put things in a space that is art. Some curators do very arty kind of curatorship nowadays. Being a curator is much more of a flashy thing to be doing now than it was a generation ago. So all these boundaries break down. You could even see installation art as sort of a continuation of the tendency of the strategy of collage, putting ready-made things into art, but done on a larger scale. So Joseph Beuys, a German artist, for a long time after the Second World War, you could say that New York was the capital of modern art, or contemporary art it would have been called then, I suppose. But once this idea of formalist purity starts to break down, so does the whole logic that says, modern art has one mainstream, and that mainstream started in Europe but travelled at a certain point across the Atlantic to the abstract expressionists and stayed in America since that time. So even though American artists like pop artists and minimalist artists are amongst the first to question that narrative, it starts to open up the door for artists from elsewhere. First for other artists from Europe, and only after a certain amount of time, in a later decade really, is it the time for artists from the rest of the world to really get to be part of that more globalized story. So Beuys is one of the key figures of European art that probably the first one who really got taken seriously in America, but his reputation there has always been a bit ambivalent in a way. Often he's making art out of objects that materials that are not often thought of as art materials, new kind of materials, not bronze and marble as a sculptor, but using fat, using felt, using honey, using copper, often materials that are sort of conductive or insulating or concerned with storing energy. Sorry, it creates a certain kind of personal mythology around around the material. I mean, this work, the chair with Fatma, just shows one of those material in use, and it's a fairly straightforward thing. I guess you could call this just a sculpture. I put it in here, even though it's not really installation. And this is complicated as well because it starts as a performance and then ends up as some kind of installation. He's on the day of a festival, May Day, 1st of May. He's sort of sweeping a public square after events have taken place there. That's sort of performative, and then all the objects he found and collected in that square by his sweeping up activity and the brush itself goes into a vitrine and gets installed into a gallery. So it's sort of, I mean, this is one dimension of what you could call installation, the sort of self-consciousness about art display itself, coming through in this piece, Sweep Up of 1972. This is more clearly a kind of installation work, you could say. This is the Pack, 1969. So, all these sort of sledges with objects such as rolls of felt on them, lined up behind a van. One kind of important thing about Joseph Beuys is the story he tells of his own wartime experience. Germany was manifestly the major aggressor in the Second World War, and for Germans in the post-war period, it's very hard to come to terms with their history, and artists feel that they have to deal with that history. They can't just boldly move forward towards the next step. They've got to have a kind of backward-looking gaze as well, because the past is not something to easily just forget. But Beuys's way of dealing with it is slightly problematic to some people's way of thinking. He was actually in the German Air Force, and his story is that he was not shot down, or his plane crashed and during the war, and that he was rescued by Tatar nomads, and they saved his life by putting fat on his body to keep the heat in, and then wrapping him with felt, sort of traditional materials that they had at hand. So it's a kind of sort of death and rebirth narrative almost, a kind of, a sort of crash and burn and then come back to life through this intervention of the kind of nomadic peoples. And then he sort of adopts a sort of shamanic persona. So some people's way of thinking, this is sort of self-mythologizing and historically suspect in some of the details. Did it literally happen in this way? This is certainly being questioned, and it's also been questioned whether such a narrative is a sort of narrative that actually sort of hides history rather than really resolving history in a good way. So these are all the issues that are there when we think about Joseph Beuys. Maybe I won't go into the whole story of his crash and everything, but it would be it's all there on the Wikipedia website. So very easily found story. Maybe I'll say more about him when we look at his performance art. Oh, just to give you one example of precursors to installation art, this is Duchamp and the Mile of String from 1942 is actually for the opening of an exhibition at a kind of Peggy Guggenheim-owned gallery in New York, and he was invited to do something for the opening, and he ended up just unraveling string across the space, which makes you aware of the space itself. Sort of takes your attention away really just from the works within it. Okay, so just some examples. Daniel Buren, French artist, Untitled 3-room installation, 1989. He works with this sort of striped material, and then it's almost like a scientific experiment where something is kept the same, and so that you can notice that other things change. You can measure the changes of other things. So the thing that's kept the same is this material, the striped material that he uses again and again in different settings. So it becomes not about that material so much as the setting itself. It's a way of drawing attention to the space, but the space slightly transformed. You could say it's a little bit like Christian and Jean-Claude wrapping things to transform them. So, for example, here is that same red and white stripy material coming back in an installation in Munster, Travail in situ, Munster, 1997. In the form of a flag installation out of doors. I'll quickly go through a whole number of different examples, jumping around from country to country. Chris Burden, American artist, all the submarines of the USA. It's sort of like a sort of documentation of all the military equipment of one particular kind associated with the US. I suppose you could say it's an anti-war, anti-militaristic gesture to kind of just point out how much of it there is. They're just made of cardboard and just suspended in the space of a gallery, so a fairly simple idea in a way. Or this is the other Vietnam Memorial, 1991. We looked last time at the Maya Lin Vietnam Memorial in Washington, and of course that just has the names of all the American dead. So here's the other side of the story. He's creating a Vietnam memorial with the names of the Vietnamese dead, except that literally that becomes impossible to do. You can't document all those names, or at least he was not in a position to do so. So he puts just stand-in Vietnamese names to kind of create a sense of the scale of the dead. And the format of it is a bit like a sort of sutra library structure, a traditional library of Buddhist scriptures. Gordon Matta-Clark, Splitting, 1975, or just as the title suggests, taking a house and kind of breaking it into two. So it's not so much something within the space as the whole space itself, but still I want to call it a kind of installation, if you like. He's the son of Matta, the surrealist artist that we looked at briefly at the very beginning of the course. Hans Haacke, Germania. Just takes its name from the name inscribed on the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale. So site-specific and time-specific too. You know, there is actually a permanent site for the Venice Biennale with national pavilions for all the countries that were part of it. Some of the more recently joining countries have their pavilions elsewhere, but on this original site, all the countries that were there from early on, like Germany, have their own national pavilions, which they use each 2-year cycle coming round. So it's funny. It's like a sort of collection of art embassies, if you want to think of it that way. There's nothing else quite like it. Other big international shows, it isn't that each space is curated by the nations themselves in this way. So you get this national representation. So here, Germany chose as their artist not an artist working in Germany, but an American-based artist of German extraction, Hans Haacke, and he's really working against the grain of the space itself. I mean, what the main thing he's picking up on is the fact that this building was rebuilt and was basically constructed during the Nazi era. So he's looking to the the bad past of this part of of the building, how it promotion of German culture and art was tied in with Nazi propaganda. So what he's added in is something very simple. He's got a photo of Hitler visiting the building, just to remind us of that. And then inside, he's taken up the floor, just destroyed the floor. Nothing else. There's nothing else there. There's no art there. This is testing the system. This is Metro Mobiliten, 1985, by Hans Haacke again. Well, it's in dialogue with the Metropolitan Museum. So the title kind of links the Metropolitan with the company Mobil, oil company. So and it's specifically about this sort of paradox that the Metropolitan had put on this show of of treasures of ancient Nigeria. So it's a show about African art, and it's sponsored by Mobil, and yet Mobil is one of the companies that is involved with South Africa, and involved with selling products to the South African military during the apartheid era. So he's trying to show the connection with art sponsorship as a way of kind of hiding or creating a good image for a company that maybe has some other darker side to it, or the way art itself provides a company with a chance to launder its reputation, or how art represents a continent in a way that's sort of depoliticized, doesn't face up to the reality of power in that place. So often for the Metropolitan, I think still today, but certainly at that time, when it had a big blockbuster exhibition on, it would have these big banners like this on its facade. So he's echoing the way the museum did that. So it's part of a tendency in art, of which he's one of the stronger early representatives of using art to critique institutions, sometimes within the institutions themselves or sometimes outside them. I sort of jumped in sequence. This is Zoe Leonard, British artist, untitled work done for the Documenter and the Ninth Documenter, 1992, where what she did was install photos of female genitalia alongside the existing works in one of the museum spaces that the documenter is using. It sort of takes over the whole city of Kassel in Germany once every 4 years. I think next year is also going to be one of these. So there are different kinds of spaces. Some spaces are just given over completely to new installations, but other spaces are only partly given over to the documenter, and they maybe still have their own permanent collections. Anyway, in this case, there's a kind of engagement with the museum and its existing portraits of women by presenting these sort of slightly clinical but also sort of shocking in a way close-up images of the female body. So, questioning how women have been represented and so forth, and what are the kind of taboos and unquestioned conventions about representation of women in art. Yeah, sorry, I have a missing slide there. I don't know how that happened. Wodiczco's light projection. That's a very simple kind of installation. So he's just projecting light onto the surface of a building. It's a way of intervening in a space that you don't otherwise have power to intervene with. A little bit like a kind of gentle graffiti, if you like, but gentle temporary graffiti on a larger scale than most graffiti is able to achieve. But this is Anthony Gormley's field of 1991. Actually, there are many of these fields. So there's an Asian field, for example, that's travelled around in different parts of China and I think elsewhere in Asia, and which has been bought by the M Plus Museum. When it opens, it should be, I suppose, a fairly prominent part of their display there. So working with everyday, ordinary people with no particular artistic skill from a particular location to make these little figurines which have a pair of eyes sort of poked in the clay form. So there's just a kind of art class workshop event takes place in which all these things are created by willing participants, and naturally each comes out slightly different, although they'll have a kind of family resemblance at the same time. Then they're all installed in whichever space that he's working with their eyes looking out at you. So you can't enter the space, but you come up to it, and it's like I suppose you think of things like the terracotta warriors or something like that, large numbers of people, although these are kind of tiny little things. All you are there to look, but you're also being looked back at. So there's the process, the community engagement, but then there's also the installation that is going on. Ian Hamilton Finlay, Scottish artist. Elegaic Inscription, 1971. One of the artists who likes to use words a lot in his art, the written word. So Bring Back the Birch has a double meaning. It's sort of elegiac in the sense of, so much of the natural environment has been destroyed, and birch is a kind of tree. Maybe there aren't so many of them now. Every so often you have diseases and certain trees disappear, like all the elm trees went and so forth. from the British landscape. So that's one meaning, but the other meaning, which I think would be fairly apparent to British people, birch, the twigs from a birch tree were used to make some kind of punishment tool for beating children who've been supposedly naughty. So bring back the birch is also like a sort of right-wing conservative statement. We should go back to corporal punishment, and back to the old days. So he's playing with a kind of double meaning there. Sorry, this is just taken from a book. That's why there's a kind of line down the middle. This is Finley's Nuclear Sail, 1974. So it's installed in his garden. Just to give you an outdoor example, he put lots of works in a setting of his own designed garden. And it's sort of a comment about the basing of nuclear submarines in Scotland and things like that, which is still an issue to for Scottish people today. British nuclear weapons are carried on submarines and their home bases in Scotland. Mona Hatoum, Light at the End, 1989. She's a Palestinian artist, so a representative of the people who don't have their own proper homeland, living kind of in exile, really. Major show of her work at the Tate Gallery last summer. Part of a whole sequence of shows trying to recover the importance of female artists who haven't received quite enough attention, by giving them an extended opportunity to show their work. So again, words I suppose are important, but just in the title, Light at the End, well, that's the phrase, light at the end of the tunnel. That means there's some sort of hope to look forward to. You can come out of a dark place. There's light at the end of the tunnel. But in this case, the light is produced by bare electricity, and it's a dead end anyway. There's no way through. So as you approach it, first you see light, and as you approach it, then you start to feel heat as well. There's more than one sensory modality at play, and you realize you can't actually touch it. If you touched it, you'd be burnt and probably electrocuted at the same time. So she's used that in other works. There's one work where she has a whole sort of installation of domestic kitchenware and so forth, all metallic, and they're all joined up with a live electric current. So the everyday objects are suddenly turned into something dangerous. Of course, there's a barrier. You can look at it, but you can't get through to touch it. Again, it would be very dangerous. But there's a sense of danger close by in replacing the sense of the everyday. Here, maybe the associations is not to the everyday, but towards art. We think of people like Dan Flavin and his light works, but this is suddenly a little bit different. So into the purified world of minimalism, maybe some political associations, or anyway, the sense of the embodied spectator is physically endangered. Suzanne Hitler. She has a kind of anthropological training that she brings to bear on her artwork sometimes. And that's the case here. She's collected people's accounts of UFOs or alien life encounters. People who feel that they've witnessed such events, and then it's a very simple installation, just hanging down in the gallery space are lots of earphones, and you're invited to listen in to whichever one or ones that you wish to, and then you'll hear people telling you their personal accounts. So it's partly about the sort of accumulation of evidence, so many voices telling something which, of course, is rather hard to believe, but the sheer accumulation sort of counts for something, creates a kind of ambiguity, makes you consider, well, why should so many people believe something? You know, it's a sort of project you could almost imagine presented as an academic project, but then presenting it as an art project, you get a different range of response, and you maybe meet a different kind of audience too. Tracy Emin, everyone I have ever slept with, 1963 to 1995. Well, slept with often is usually taken as meaning have sex with, but in her case I think it is more just slept with, so everyone that she shared a bed with, not just her sexual partners. So she likes to produce works out of her own autobiography in a very wearing your heart on your sleeve kind of way. Patrina Fritsch, Madonna figure, 1987. So just, yeah, it's just like a sort of traditional Madonna statue, but in this bright yellow monochrome, installed unsettlingly into public space. So it's only it's largely the installation that makes it into something that's unusual. It gives the sense of encountering something where you wouldn't normally expect to encounter it. It's almost a reverse of something like Duchamp's ready-mades, where you're taking everyday objects into a gallery. Here you're taking something which lives in a gallery, or perhaps in a church or some other kind of religious setting, and then you put it out into the street where it encounters people it wouldn't normally encounter. There's just something about sculpture that anyway that it takes up it takes up space in the same way human bodies do. So it has a kind of a slightly kind of uncanny, lifelike quality about it. This is really a very quick look through some examples. I mean, I could have chosen a whole different sequence of images to tell the same story. There are so many artists at work today who use installation as a strategy, but this is just a few, and I want to include some Asian artists. So Su Do-ho, Korean artist. Seoul Home, LA Home, well, an artist who lived and worked in the USA, so dealing, as so many people do nowadays, with the experience of migrancy, of displacement, voluntary or otherwise, living away from where you were born, away from a place you may consider your home. So taking a fabric reconstruction of a Korean house and then sort of recreating it indoors in a gallery setting in LA. Well, the same artist has done similar things in other locations. So putting two places together, a sort of ghost of your home, in the sense of it's not quite there, but it just has a sort of presence somehow, a trace. sorry, this is Gu Wenda's United Nations series, Temple of Heaven, 1997. One of several works that Gu Wenda has made using hair as a material. Well, he has an interest in hair. He also has an interest in writing, and both of them come together here with the hair used to create kind of equivalent to writing systems, and it's writing systems of more than one culture often. So that hence this idea of United Nations. He's bringing together different cultures through their writing, but also through their hair, because he's gathering hair from different sources around the world. You know, there are actually places you can go and buy hair, say, if you want to make wigs and things like that. So he's using those sources. And then gluing them onto these translucent surfaces to create these kind of veils which are installed into gallery space. So this is one that he produced for Hong Kong during the handover period. I guess you could say it's a kind of healing process. It's talking about bringing together things from different cultures and putting them all in one place at the same time, healing the conjuncture between Hong Kong's past and future at the moment of its transition. So it's site-specific in its meaning. Maybe that transition is less problematic for him because he's not from Hong Kong. He's looking at it kind of from the outside in that sense. Hong Kong artists, again, there are many, even just amongst Hong Kong artists I could have chosen, but I've chosen Man Ching-ying. This is her work, Sightseeing, of 1996. Actually, you may notice a lot of the last few names I've been giving are those of female artists. And there's something about installation that because it's a medium that doesn't have a long history, somehow maybe that enables women artists to feel more free in using it. You know, it hasn't got 1,000 years of history of, you know, being dominated by male artists, say like oil painting or ink painting or some more long established medium. Same kind of logic is true for something like video art. You know, there isn't this long history, and therefore there's a kind of freedom of dealing with it. It works for women artists in a male-dominated art world, but it also works for non-Western artists coming into an art world that had been very much a Western art world. Sometimes the modern mediums like photography, or even more recent mediums like video and installation, are easier to deal with in that way. Also, maybe because installation allows you to bring objects like collage. It allows you to bring objects that have associations. It could be objects from your own cultural situation that you bring in. That, I think, was particularly important for Hong Kong artists. Not specifically Man Ching-ying, but Phoebe Mann, but for others, because maybe Hong Kong doesn't have its own distinctive local high culture, but it has its own distinctive local popular culture. So there are ways in which you could signify a sense of Hong Kong identity through popular culture, and installation could make use of popular culture objects to specify a certain time. But also around this period, 1990, mid-1990s onwards, especially at that time when the handover was just about to approach, a lot of Hong Kong artists are thinking about local identity at the point at which something big is happening to them. And they're thinking about the past at the point when the past is somehow going to be changed or maybe even erased. So she's dealing with the physical transformation of the city in this work, Sightseeing. so much is of rebuilding going on at that time, and she's sort of reading the physical change of the city as somehow connected to its political change. You know, a lot of big infrastructural projects were initiated after the June 4th massacre in 1989 to try and boost the Hong Kong economy in the last few years before the handover, to make everything seem, you know, good. You know, make sure that at least people had jobs and so forth. And there was a sense of, you know, building a new airport was the main thing, and all the infrastructure of the railway into Hong Kong Island that came with that. So she's taken fragments from construction sites, like these broken mirrors and so forth, and stored them in the gallery, and then she's projecting images of the changing cityscape onto it. That's the main thing going on. This is what she actually did for the handover period itself, reunification with China, I am happy. So at that point in time, the handover, lots of companies were putting all these kind of very patriotic slogans out on the facades of their buildings because, you know, they thought it would be good for them to do that. So she's sort of mimicking that language of kind of instant patriotism. You know, all these big businessmen that were very happy supporters of the British when they were in power, and suddenly become happy supporters of Beijing at the shift of power. So she's taking those external slogans and putting them indoors, and by just repeating them, that kind of being over enthusiastic somehow kind of undermines enthusiasm, but also sometimes she leaves out characters which can shift the meaning to be the opposite. Let's take our break there, and then we'll come back to look at performance art.